Billionaire accuses Black Maid of beating his daughter. Girl points at him and says it wasn't her, it was Daddy. The courtroom fell into silence so heavy it could crush a soul. All eyes turned to the small girl clutching her doll, her hands trembling, her voice barely more than a whisper. She pointed with a shaking finger, not at the maid accused of beating her, but at the man everyone thought untouchable. It wasn't her, she said, her words cracking through the air like glass shattering. It was Daddy. Gasps erupted. The billionaire's confident smirk vanished, replaced with a flash of fury. In that single moment, the story the world thought it knew collapsed. But this revelation didn't come out of nowhere. No, this was the breaking point of a storm that had been building for days. To understand how an innocent maid found herself accused of a crime she didn't commit, and how the truth slipped out through the lips of a terrified child, we must go back to the beginning. It all started one night. The flash of red and blue lights painted the mansion walls like fire. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second, until they drowned out the night itself. Reporters pressed against the iron gates, shouting questions, their cameras snapping like gunfire. The scene was chaos, yet at the center of it all, one man stood calm, too calm. Billionaire Richard Holloway, in his tailored black suit and silk tie, pointed a trembling finger at the woman in handcuffs. His voice carried over the noise, sharp and commanding. "She did it," he thundered. "That maid laid her filthy hands on my daughter. Arrest her. I want her gone from my sight." Before we dive deep into the story, subscribe to Black Voice Matters channel and tell us where you are watching from. The crowd gasped. Cameras zoomed in, and whispers rippled through the air like poison spreading in water. All eyes shifted to the woman being dragged toward the police car. Her name was Grace. She wore a faded uniform, now wrinkled and damp with tears. Her wrists ached under the cold steel cuffs, but the real weight pressing down on her was heavier. Humiliation, fear, and betrayal. She shook her head desperately, trying to make her voice heard above the chaos. "No, I would never hurt her," Grace cried, her words breaking, her voice swallowed by the frenzy of voices outside. "I love that child like my own. Please believe me." But no one listened. Not the reporters who had already written their stories before the truth was told. Not the police officers who avoided her eyes as they shoved her into the back seat. And certainly not Richard Holloway, whose cold glare cut deeper than the cuffs ever could. Behind the thick glass window of the mansion, a little girl stood frozen, 8 years old, with golden curls falling over her pale face. She pressed her hand against the glass as though she could stop time, as though she could stop the world from swallowing Grace whole. Tears brimmed in her wide eyes, but her lips said nothing. She watched as her father painted a monster out of the only person who had ever truly cared for her. And that was the moment the story began. The story that would shatter a family, expose a billionaire, and reveal a truth so chilling that the world would struggle to look away. The headlines erupted before dawn. Child beaten by maid in billionaire's mansion. Holloway family tragedy. Maid in custody. Television anchors spoke with feigned concern. Bloggers spat venom across the internet, and social media became a graveyard for Grace's reputation. Another case of domestic staff abuse, one commentator declared. "People like her shouldn't even be allowed near children," another wrote online, as likes and retweets multiplied. No one asked where Grace came from. No one asked about her story. All they saw was the headline, and all they believed was the word of a powerful man. But behind the flashing lights, the iron gates, and the carefully staged narrative of wealth and authority, something darker lingered, and only one small, terrified voice held the power to expose it. Grace sat in the back of the patrol car, the leather seat sticky against her skin, her tears leaving trails down her face. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum of doom. She whispered to herself over and over, as though the repetition might somehow summon justice. "I didn't do it. I didn't do it. God knows I didn't do it." But God was not the one with the microphone. God was not the one who owned every news channel, every newspaper, every politician in the city. Richard Holloway was, and Richard had already decided who would take the fall. The interrogation room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke. The air was heavy, the walls bare except for a single clock ticking louder than her own heartbeat. Grace sat across from two detectives, her hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. "Tell us what happened. Detective Lewis demanded, leaning forward. His voice was calm, but his eyes held no mercy. "I was in the kitchen," Grace said, her voice trembling. "I was making dinner when I heard her scream. I ran upstairs and you found her crying," the second detective cut in, "with bruises on her arms." Grace shook her head frantically. "I didn't touch her. When I got there, she was already crying. I tried to hold her, to calm her, but the bruises," Louis said flatly. "How do you explain them?" Grace's breath hitched. Her lips quivered as she searched for words that would never be enough. "I don't know," she whispered. "All I know is it wasn't me." The detectives exchanged a look, the kind of look that said they had already made up their minds. In their eyes, she was guilty before she even walked through the door. And yet, somewhere, deep inside Grace's breaking heart, a tiny spark of hope remained. Because she remembered the little girl's eyes, the fear, the hesitation, the way she almost spoke. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would come out. At dawn the next morning, Grace was led into the courtroom. Her uniform replaced by a drab prison jumpsuit, her wrist still bruised from the cuffs. The gallery was full, reporters, onlookers, and strangers eager for blood. On the other side sat Richard Halloway, surrounded by lawyers in expensive suits. His face was a mask of grief and anger, but his eyes flickered with something else, control. The judge's gavel slammed. Silence fell. "Grace Adeyemi," the judge said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You stand accused of child assault. How do you plead?" Grace swallowed hard. Her throat was dry, her body trembling, but her voice, fragile as it was, rose through the stillness. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile against the weight of wealth and power pressing down on her. The judge nodded, making notes. The billionaire smirked, and from the corner of the courtroom, the little girl stared at Grace with eyes that begged for something. Courage, maybe, or simply the truth. And then, in a moment that silenced the entire room, the judge asked the child to step forward. Her small footsteps echoed like thunder. Her tiny hands shook as she held her doll against her chest. She looked at her father, at his commanding eyes urging her to stay quiet, and then at Grace, whose face carried nothing but desperate love. The judge bent down, his voice gentle. "Sweetheart, can you tell us who hurt you?" The child hesitated. Time seemed to stop. And then she lifted her trembling finger and pointed at her father. Her voice cracked as tears spilled down her cheeks. "It wasn't her," she whispered. "It was Daddy." The courtroom had exploded like a bomb. The words still hung in the air, fragile, trembling, but louder than any gavel. "It wasn't her, it was Daddy." Gasps echoed through the chamber. Reporters clutched their pens as though they'd just witnessed history. Lawyers froze mid-sentence. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, his lined face breaking with disbelief. But Richard Halloway did not flinch. For the briefest of moments, his expression cracked. Anger flickered in his eyes, rage coiled in his jaw, but almost instantly, the mask returned. He stood tall, his voice booming as though he could drown out his daughter's words with sheer force. "She's confused," he thundered, slamming his palm against the polished table. "My little girl is scared. She doesn't know what she's saying," the gallery murmured, torn between shock and suspicion. Grace, standing there in her grey prison jumpsuit, felt her knees weaken. Relief surged through her veins, but fear chased it quickly after. The truth had escaped the child's lips. Yes, but in a room like this, truth was not enough. Not when money could bury it. Not when power could strangle it. The judge banged his gavel, demanding silence. "Order! Order in this court!" The little girl was escorted back to her seat, her small hand clutching the sleeve of a bailiff like it was her only lifeline. She would not look at her father. And for Richard, that betrayal cut deeper than any knife. Grace was taken back into custody as the hearing adjourned. She was ushered into the holding area, the cuffs biting at her wrists again. But for the first time since her arrest, her heart carried a flicker of hope. She spoke, Grace whispered to herself, tears welling in her eyes. She spoke the truth. Her lawyer, a thin man with tired eyes named Mr. Salami, leaned close as the guards looked away. "Listen to me, Grace. That testimony was powerful, but don't think it'll save you. Richard's team will bury it, twist it, make it look like a child's fantasy. We need more. We need something solid." Grace nodded weakly, But her thoughts weren't on strategy. They were on the girl. Her sweet, gentle smile, the way she used to curl up beside Grace in the evenings when her father was too busy to care. The little one had loved her like family, and today she had risked everything by pointing at the man the world feared to accuse. The media circus spun out of control by nightfall. Every channel played the clip. In an unprecedented twist, billionaire Richard Holloway's daughter accused her father of abuse today in court. Some anchors spoke cautiously, afraid of defamation suits. Others leaned into the sensationalism, their voices dripping with suspicion. Social media split down the middle. Children don't lie about these things. She's telling the truth. That Maid manipulated her. Kids are easy to confuse. Classic tactic. Grace is innocent. Holloway is hiding something. Be serious. Why would a billionaire hurt his own child? The battle lines were drawn, but in the court of public opinion, Richard still had the advantage. His wealth bought him airtime, sympathetic experts, and influencers willing to paint Grace as a cunning liar. That night, as Grace lay on the narrow bed in her cell, she thought of home. She thought of the small house she had left behind in Lagos, where her mother still lived. She thought of her son, barely a teenager, waiting for money that might never come now. Her story was not unusual. She had come here like many others, through an agency that promised stable work, steady pay, and a chance to give her family a better life. But reality was harsher. Endless hours, little rest, constant demands. And yet, despite the exhaustion, Grace had grown attached to the little girl in her care. She became more than just a job. She was a child in need of love, and Grace had given it freely. Now that love had been twisted into chains around her wrists. Meanwhile, in the Holloway mansion, the atmosphere was poisonous. Richard paced his study like a caged beast, his phone glued to his ear. His lawyers spoke in hurried tones. "We'll claim the girl is traumatized. Confused," one said. "Children her age are unreliable witnesses." "We'll leak a story about the maid's background," another added. "Make her look unstable, dangerous. Public opinion will swing back." Richard slammed his fist onto the desk. "Do it. Destroy her, and make sure my daughter understands if she speaks again she'll regret it." He ended the call and poured himself a drink, his hand trembling for the first time all day. For Richard Holloway, reputation was everything. Wealth, power, influence, they were all threads in a fragile web, and now one frightened little girl threatened to unravel it all. The girl Anna sat quietly in her room, hugging her doll. The mansion felt colder than ever. She thought of Grace, of the warmth she brought into the house, of the lullabies she hummed when storms shook the windows at night. Without her, everything felt empty. Her father entered the room, and the air grew heavy. He knelt before her, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "You were confused today, sweetheart," he said softly, though his voice carried an edge that made her stomach twist. "You didn't mean what you said, did you?" Anna clutched her doll tighter, saying nothing. His smile faded. He leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "If you repeat that lie again, there will be consequences. Do you understand?" Her small head nodded quickly, though her eyes brimmed with tears. And in that moment, Anna learned the terrible cost of truth. Back in her cell, Grace drifted into restless dreams. She dreamed of home. She dreamed of Anna's laughter echoing in the halls. She dreamed of the moment in court when the girl had saved her, and the fear that followed. When she woke, her lawyer was there again, his brow furrowed. "They're moving fast," he said. "Richard's team filed motions to suppress Anna's testimony, claiming she was coerced. They're painting you as manipulative, someone who tricked a child into blaming her own father." Grace's heart sank. "But that's not true. I've never—" "I know," Mr. Salami said firmly. "But truth isn't enough here. We need proof." Proof. That word echoed in her head all day. Somewhere in that mansion, somewhere behind the locked doors and polished lies, proof existed. But how could she reach it from inside these walls? The days dragged on, each one heavier than the last. News reports painted her as a villain. Commentators tore her apart. Even strangers in the gallery whispered words like monster and liar when she passed. And yet, despite it all, Grace held on to Anna's trembling words. It wasn't her. It was Daddy. Because no matter how powerful Richard was, No matter how carefully he crafted his world, the truth had slipped through once, and Grace prayed it would slip through again. But Richard was not a man who left loose ends. A week after the hearing, Grace was woken in her cell to the sound of guards opening the door. "Visitation," one muttered. She stepped into the small visitation room, her heart stopping when she saw who waited on the other side of the glass. It was Anna. But the little girl's face was pale, her eyes red from crying. She pressed her hand against the glass, and Grace mirrored it, their palms meeting through the cold barrier. "I'm sorry," Anna whispered, though the intercom barely caught her words. "They told me not to talk anymore. They said they'll take me away if I do." Grace's throat tightened. "Don't be sorry, my love. You were brave. You spoke the truth. Hold on to that." Tears spilled down the girl's cheeks. "I miss you. I'm scared." Before Grace could reply, the guards ended the visit, pulling her back. Her cries echoed down the hall, unanswered. And in that moment, Grace realized just how far Richard was willing to go. That night, news broke again. A source close to the family leaked a new story, one that accused Grace of coercion and manipulation, claiming she had filled Anna's head with lies to protect herself. Grace's photo appeared on every screen, her eyes frozen in mid-tear. The headline beneath it read, "The maid who turned a child against her father." The world began to turn against her once more, and as Richard raised his glass in the safety of his mansion, he smiled coldly. The battle was far from over, but he still believed he controlled the board. What he didn't know, what he couldn't control, was that Anna's fear was slowly turning into something stronger, something he hadn't accounted for. The truth had already slipped through once. It would slip through again, and when it did, it would destroy him. The storm outside the courthouse had calmed, but inside the city, another storm was brewing. Newspapers had spun the child's words into confusion. Television anchors repeated the billionaire's narrative as gospel, and the online world boiled with debate. For every voice crying that the girl had spoken truth, there were 5 insisting she was a frightened child manipulated by a cunning maid. Grace watched it unfold from the confines of her cell. The television in the common area blared with headlines that cut her deeper than any chains. "Maid coerces child into false accusations. Grace Adeyemi, innocent servant or master manipulator." Her fellow inmates glanced at her sideways, whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. In their eyes, she was no longer just another prisoner. She was a headline. Grace buried her face in her hands. "God, how do I fight a man who owns the truth itself?" Her lawyer, Mr. Salami, leaned over the table in the visitation room later that day, his voice low, his eyes sharp with urgency. "You don't," he said. "Not alone, but others are starting to notice. We may have allies." "Allies," Grace repeated, hope flickering. He nodded. "There's a journalist, an independent one. She doesn't bow to money or pressure. She reached out this morning, says she's been following the case and she doesn't buy the story." Grace lifted her eyes, searching his face. "Do you think she can help?" "She might be the only one who can," he replied. "But we'll need to give her something to work with. We need to dig." That journalist's name was Evelyn Torres. She wasn't like the others, the smiling anchors on TV, the well-dressed reporters who lived off billionaire scraps. Evelyn was raw, hungry for truth, and dangerous to men like Richard. She showed up at Mr. Salami's office that night, her notepad already filled with scribbles. "I've been watching Holloway for years," she said without preamble, her voice steady. "He's got skeletons in his closets. Too many rumors, too many staff disappearing without explanation. But no one's ever been brave enough to go after him, until now." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "If that little girl said what she said in open court, then I believe her. Kids don't invent monsters, they point at the ones they already see." Grace wept quietly when she heard Evelyn's words later, carried through the attorney. For the first time, someone outside these walls believed her. Meanwhile, inside the mansion, the air grew heavier by the day. Anna lived in silence, her footsteps quiet on the marble floors, her voice barely more than a whisper. The house that once echoed with her laughter now groaned like a haunted shell. At night, when the halls were dark, she would creep past doors she was never supposed to open. One in particular drew her eyes, a thick oak door at the end of the west corridor. Her father had warned her never to go near it. "That's my study," he had said, his voice sharp. "Stay out." But Anna wasn't a child without eyes or ears. She had seen the servants slip in and out. She had heard whispers of arguments, muffled cries, and once, just once, the sound of something breaking, followed by silence that felt like a scream swallowed whole. She clutched her doll tighter each time she passed it, her heart pounding, her curiosity battling her fear. One evening, curiosity won. Anna waited until the house was asleep, until the servants' quarters were quiet, until her father's heavy footsteps had retreated to his room. Then, barefoot and trembling, she crept down the corridor. The oak door loomed before her like a giant. She reached out, her small hand pressing against the cold brass handle. It turned. The room was dark, but the faint glow of a desk lamp illuminated piles of folders, photographs, and a small locked box. Papers spilled across the desk, contracts, receipts, names she didn't recognize. But what caught her breath was a photograph half hidden beneath the stack. It was of her. Her own face stared back at her, bruises visible on her arms, her cheek reddened. The date scribbled at the bottom made her stomach twist. It was from weeks ago, before anyone else had noticed. A creak behind her made her whirl. Her father stood in the doorway. The fury in his eyes sent her scrambling. She dropped the photo and clutched her doll, her legs carrying her as fast as they could back to her room. She slammed the door and hid under the covers, trembling. That night, she dreamed of Grace's arms, of the lullabies that used to soothe her to sleep, and she knew without Grace there was no safety left. Evelyn's investigation grew deeper. She tracked down former staff members, maids, gardeners, drivers who had once worked for Richard Halloway. Most refused to speak. Fear had built walls around their memories. But one old gardener, his hands rough from years of labor, finally cracked. "I saw things," he whispered, eyes darting nervously. "Things a man shouldn't do to his own child. I kept quiet because, well, who would believe me over him? But if you're really digging, if you really want the truth, then you should know. Grace isn't the first." Evelyn's pen froze. "What do you mean?" He swallowed hard. "Other maids before her. They got too close, too protective of the girl, and then they were gone. Sent back home, or just disappeared. Nobody asked questions." Her blood ran cold. She pressed him for more, but he shut down, fear sealing his lips. Still, his words were enough to ignite the fire. This wasn't just about Grace. This was about a pattern. Grace sat in her cell when her lawyer returned, Evelyn at his side. "We have something," Evelyn said, her eyes burning with urgency. "Not enough for court yet, but enough to pull the thread." There were others, Grace, other maids, other staff. They all vanished when they tried to protect Anna. "This isn't just your story, it's bigger." Grace's eyes widened. Her chest tightened as memories flooded back. She remembered Mary, the maid before her, a kind woman who always whispered encouragement. One day she had spoken up quietly in the kitchen about the bruises on Anna's arm. 2 weeks later she was gone. "They told me she went home," Grace murmured. "But I knew it wasn't right. She didn't even get to say goodbye." The pieces clicked together, and the horror was worse than anything she'd imagined. Richard wasn't blind to the shadows closing in. His lawyers warned him of the whispers, the leaks, the journalists sniffing around. "Handle it," he ordered coldly. And so the threats began. Evelyn found her car tires slashed one night, a dead bird nailed to her door the next morning. Anonymous calls flooded her phone. "Drop it, or you'll regret it." But Evelyn wasn't the kind to back down. If anything, the threats only sharpened her resolve. She dug deeper, finding financial records hidden in shell companies, payouts to silence former staff, offshore accounts funneling money through back doors. Each piece built the picture of a man who thought himself untouchable. And still, the question loomed. Where was the proof? The undeniable evidence that would topple him? The answer came from Anna. One stormy night, with the rain lashing against the windows, Anna sat alone in her room, her doll clutched to her chest. She had hidden something, a secret she hadn't told anyone, not even Grace. Underneath her mattress, wrapped in a handkerchief, was a small, battered diary. She had started writing months ago, scribbling down the things she couldn't say out loud. Each page carried the weight of her fear. "Daddy hurt me again today." Grace tried to help me. She always tries. I wish he would stop. I wish someone would believe me. Page after page, a child's trembling handwriting chronicled the truth. But Anna was only a child. She didn't know the power of what she held. The diary slipped into Evelyn's hands weeks later, smuggled out by one of the last brave servants in the house. When Evelyn opened it, her hands shook. This was it, the weapon Richard could never silence. But Richard was already aware. He had eyes everywhere. By the time Evelyn sat at her desk typing her report, her phone buzzed with a message. No sender, just 3 words that froze her blood. We know everything. And in the mansion, Richard poured himself another drink, his eyes fixed on the storm outside. He knew the walls were closing in. But he wasn't planning to go down quietly. The courtroom was packed to the brim, every seat filled, every corner buzzing with tension. The air felt heavy, like the whole world had squeezed itself into those 4 walls. Reporters filled the gallery, cameras flashed, and television crews outside broadcasted the trial live. The people wanted blood, and Richard Halloway was determined to make sure it wasn't his. Grace sat at the defense table, her hands trembling in her lap. Her jumpsuit had been exchanged for a modest dress her lawyer provided, but it did little to ease her nerves. She felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her. On the other side, Richard entered flanked by his team of lawyers. They looked like wolves in designer suits, sleek, polished, dangerous. Richard walked with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him victory. He didn't glance at Grace. He didn't even glance at Anna, who sat quietly in the gallery clutching her doll. He didn't need to. His lawyers would do the looking, the tearing, the crushing. The judge banged the gavel. We'll proceed. The prosecution opened with fire. Richard's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Donovan Crane, paced the courtroom like a general commanding an army. His voice was smooth, persuasive, dripping with certainty. Ladies and gentlemen, Crane began, what we have here is not a case of abuse. What we have here is a case of desperation, manipulation and lies. He pointed at Grace, his finger sharp as a blade. This woman saw an opportunity. She was drowning in debt back home. She came here to work for Mr. Halloway, and when she realized how wealthy he was, she hatched a plan. She turned his own daughter against him, whispering lies into her young, impressionable mind. The gallery murmured. The words slithered through the air like poison, and Grace felt her heart sink. Crane continued, painting Richard as the victim, a father devastated, a man of integrity brought low by deceit. He pointed to Anna's testimony, dismissing it as childish confusion. Children, at her age, are fragile. They confuse dreams with reality, imagination with truth, and when an adult whispers enough lies into their ears, they begin to believe them. He ended with a flourish, his voice thundering. This case isn't about abuse, it's about betrayal, and we will prove that. Richard sat back, his lips curling into a faint smile. The battle had begun. When it was Grace's turn, her knees nearly buckled as she walked to the stand. The oath felt heavy on her tongue. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Her lawyer, Mr. Salami, guided her gently. Grace, he said softly, tell us about Anna. Tell us about your relationship with her. Grace's eyes welled. She is like my own child. I came here to work, to send money home, but she became family to me. I never hurt her. I would never. Her voice broke, but she pressed on. She spoke of nights spent comforting Anna, of bruises she noticed long before anyone else, of her fear when she realized the child's suffering was not an accident. The gallery shifted. Some eyes softened, some hardened. For the first time, Grace's humanity pierced through the billionaire's narrative. But Crane was ready. When cross-examination came, he rose with the precision of a predator. Grace, he said, his voice deceptively gentle. You love money, don't you? Grace blinked. I love my family. I work to support them. He pounced. And isn't it true you had debts back in Nigeria? Isn't it true you begged Mr. Halloway for a loan once? Grace's lips trembled. I asked for an advance on my wages. Yes, to pay for my son's school. Crane turned to the jury, his hands spread wide. Ah, so the motive appears. A woman drowning in debt, seeing the riches of her employer, and suddenly conveniently she accuses him of unspeakable crimes. Isn't that correct? No, Grace cried, her voice cracking. That's not true. The judge silenced her with a gavel strike. Crane smirked. The damage was done. Then came Evelyn. The journalist walked to the stand, her notepad clutched tightly. She testified about her investigation, the missing staff, the gardener's confession, the intimidation tactics, and then she produced it. Anna's diary. The courtroom hushed as the small, battered book was handed to the judge. Its pages, filled with a child's shaky handwriting, were read aloud. Daddy hurt me again today. Grace tried to protect me. I'm scared. I don't want him to find out I wrote this. The words hit the room like thunder. Gasps rippled, and even the judge's face hardened. But Richard's lawyers leapt into action. This is nonsense, Crane barked. A child scribbles. Anyone could have written this. We demand it be dismissed as inadmissible fantasy. The judge allowed the diary into evidence, but the damage control had begun. Richard's team twisted, mocked, and belittled it. Yet the seed was planted. The world had glimpsed something raw, something undeniable. And then, the moment everyone waited for, the bailiff escorted Anna to the stand. She looked so small, so fragile, her doll clutched tightly in her arms. The courtroom fell silent. Sweetheart, the judge said kindly, can you tell us what you remember? Anna's lips quivered. She glanced at her father. His eyes were cold, commanding, a silent threat. She looked at Grace. Grace's eyes brimmed with love, silent encouragement. And then Anna spoke. Her voice was faint at first, but as the words spilled out, they grew stronger. He hurt me. Daddy hurt me. Grace never did. Grace tried to help me. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. Some jurors looked away, shaken. Reporters scribbled furiously. Crane rose swiftly, circling the child like a wolf. Anna, sweetheart, he said with mock gentleness. Children sometimes imagine things, don't they? Did Grace ever tell you to say these things? No, Anna said firmly. She told me to always tell the truth. And are you sure, Crane pressed, his voice tightening, that you're not just confused, that you're not mixing up dreams with reality? Anna's small hands clutched her doll. Her voice trembled, but it carried through the chamber. I'm not confused. It was Daddy. Gasps erupted again. Richard slammed his fist on the table, his mask slipping for the first time. Enough, he barked. The judge glared at him. Mr. Holloway, control yourself. But the gallery had seen it, the crack in the perfect facade. Desperate to regain control, Richard's lawyers put him on the stand. He spoke with charm, his voice rich with rehearsed grief. He painted himself as a victim, a father whose love had been twisted, whose generosity had been betrayed. Do you really think I would harm my own flesh and blood? He thundered. I have given her everything, the best schools, the best home, and this is how I'm repaid, by lies, by betrayal from a servant I welcomed into my house. Some in the gallery nodded. His charisma was powerful, his presence commanding. But beneath the surface, his composure wavered. Sweat beaded on his brow. His eyes darted too quickly when the diary was mentioned again. And when Evelyn's threats were brought up, his jaw clenched. He was slipping. The trial stretched late into the evening, tension tightening like a noose. And then, just as it seemed Richard's performance might sway the jury, Evelyn rushed back into the courtroom, clutching a USB drive. Her face was pale, her breath ragged. Your Honor, she cried, we've found something. New evidence. The room erupted, and the judge frowned. What is this? Evelyn's hands shook as she held it up. Security footage, from inside the mansion. It shows, she hesitated, her voice catching. It shows what really happened. The gallery gasped. Richard's face drained of color. His lawyers scrambled, shouting objections, demanding the evidence be reviewed in private. But the judge's gavel thundered. We will see it tomorrow morning. The courtroom buzzed like a hive. Grace clasped her hands, whispering a prayer. Anna held her doll tighter, hope flickering in her eyes. And Richard sat frozen, his mask shattered, his empire teetering on the edge. The world would see. The courtroom was overflowing the next morning. Reporters jammed every corner, cameras lined the hallways, and even those who had scoffed at the case before now pressed forward, hungry to see the billionaire's empire either hold or fall. Grace sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her heart pounded like a drumbeat, each second heavier than the last. Beside her, Mr. Salami whispered, "Stay strong. Today everything changes." On the other side, Richard Holloway entered with his army of lawyers. His suit was sharper than ever, his tie perfectly knotted, his smile practiced. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted quickly, too quickly, like a man who knew his fortress was crumbling. The judge struck the gavel. "Proceed." Evelyn Torres rose from her seat, clutching the USB drive. The weight of it seemed enormous. She walked to the bench, her heels clicking like gunshots against the polished floor. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but taut, "we submit into evidence surveillance footage recovered from the Holloway estate. It has been authenticated by independent forensic analysts. The contents will speak for themselves." The judge nodded. "Play the footage." The lights dimmed. The screen flickered to life. At first, the video was grainy, the angle slightly tilted, but soon the shapes became clear. The lavish interior of the Holloway mansion filled the screen. The gilded walls, the heavy drapes. And then, movement. Richard entered, towering over little Anna, his face twisted in fury. The sound was muted, but his gestures were unmistakable. A raised hand, a child recoiling, a figure of power looming over one of innocence. Anna flinched as his palm struck her, the blow echoing even in silence. The gallery gasped. Reporters dropped their pens. Grace covered her mouth with trembling hands. The footage continued. Grace rushed into the frame, her arms wrapping protectively around the crying child. Richard shoved her aside, his lips forming words of venom, his finger jabbing like a weapon. The timestamp at the corner proved it, the night before Grace's arrest. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. When the video ended, the screen went black. For a moment, no one spoke. Then whispers swelled like a rising tide. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Holloway, do you wish to respond?" Richard stood, his face crimson, his composure slipping like sand through fingers. This is nonsense," he roared. "Doctored footage, lies. You expect me to believe this garbage?" But his voice cracked, his mask shattered. Crane, his lead lawyer, scrambled to object, but the gallery had already seen enough. The jury's faces were pale, their eyes hard. The evidence was undeniable. Richard slammed his fist on the table, his control unraveling. "She's my daughter, mine. I can raise her how I see fit." The words slipped before he could stop them. The courtroom froze. In that instant, the polished billionaire image was gone. What remained was raw, ugly power, naked and exposed. The judge's gavel thundered. "Mr. Holloway, enough." But it was too late. The world had seen the truth. The charges against Grace crumbled like ash. Her lawyer rose, his voice ringing with triumph. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. My client is innocent. The true abuser stands before you unmasked." The judge nodded slowly, his expression grave. "The court hereby dismisses all charges against Grace Adeyemi. Furthermore, this court moves to consider charges against Richard Holloway." The gallery erupted. Some wept, some cheered, others shouted in disbelief. Reporters scrambled for their phones, racing to broadcast the news. Grace sat frozen, her tears streaming silently. She felt weight lift from her chest, years of pain and fear dissolving in a flood of relief. She turned her head, and there was Anna, standing small but brave in the gallery. Their eyes met, and in that single glance, the bond between them, stronger than blood, stronger than fear, was sealed forever. Before adjourning, the judge allowed Anna to speak. The child stepped forward, her doll clutched in one hand, her voice trembling but unbreakable. "I told the truth," she said softly. "Nobody believed me at first, but Grace did. She always believed me. She kept me safe. She's my family." Her words cut through the air, sharper than any lawyer's argument. Tears spilled in the gallery. Even the court stenographer paused, her fingers trembling above the keys. Grace's chest heaved with silent sobs. She wanted to run to Anna, to hold her tight, but the bailiff held her back gently. The time would come. The gavel fell. "Mr. Holloway, you are under arrest for child abuse, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation. The room exploded. Officers moved swiftly, their hands gripping Richard's arms as he struggled, shouting threats. "You'll regret this," he bellowed. "All of you. I built this city. You think you can tear me down?" But his words fell flat. His empire of fear had collapsed. The mighty billionaire was dragged out in chains, his face red with rage, his legacy shattered before the world. And for the first time in years, Anna smiled. A small, fragile smile, but real. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Headlines flipped overnight. Billionaire monster. Holloway arrested for child abuse. Grace Adeyemi, the innocent maid who saved a child. Anna's diary. The truth that brought down a giant. Evelyn's article went viral, her words searing into history. For years, Richard Holloway's wealth shielded him from scrutiny. But one child's courage, one woman's loyalty, and one journalist's persistence tore the mask away. Grace was released, walking out of the courthouse to a sea of flashing cameras. But she didn't care about the noise, the lights, or the questions. She cared about one thing only. Anna ran into her arms. The child clung to her, sobbing into her chest, whispering over and over, "You're my real family. Don't leave me." Grace held her tight, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm not leaving, my love. Not ever." The system took time. Custody battles, foster care hearings, psychological evaluations. The machinery of bureaucracy churned slowly. But through it all, Anna insisted on one thing. She wanted to stay with Grace. And eventually, the court listened. Months later, Grace and Anna walked hand in hand out of the courthouse, this time not as maid and child, but as family. The sunlight bathed them in gold, the world watching as they stepped into a future rebuilt on truth. Grace found work again, not as a servant but as a caregiver in her own right, respected and free. Evelyn kept in touch, turning their story into a testament of resilience, and Anna began to heal. The nightmares still came sometimes, but in Grace's arms, she felt safe enough to face them. Richard Holloway's downfall shook the city. His companies lost value, his name became a curse, but his ruin carried a message: power cannot bury the truth forever. And Grace's story spread. She became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of courage. Schools invited her to speak, organizations reached out, and parents whispered her name as an example of unwavering love. Yet, for Grace, the true victory wasn't in headlines or applause. It was in the quiet moments at night, when Anna curled beside her and whispered, "Good night, Mama." In the end, the story of Grace and Anna reminds us that truth is not measured by wealth, nor silenced by power. For a time, lies may dominate the headlines, and injustice may wear the mask of respectability. But truth has a way of breaking through, often carried on the trembling voice of the most vulnerable. Grace, a maid with no power and no wealth, stood accused by a man who had everything the world could offer. Yet her dignity, her compassion, and her unwavering faith in truth proved stronger than his empire of lies. And Anna, a child, reminded us all that courage does not always come with age. Sometimes it is born in innocence. This story forces us to reflect on how often society listens to the loudest voices while ignoring the cries of the weak. It challenges us to ask, how many Graces have been silenced? How many Annas still sit in the shadows, waiting for someone to believe them? Power can build walls, but it cannot build justice. Money can buy silence, but it cannot buy truth. And no matter how deep the lies are buried, one day they will surface, and when they do, they will topple the towers built upon them. If you enjoyed this story, like this video and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from.